afternoon. My name's Lucy and I'm the health professional lead at Kidney Cancer UK. So today is World Kidney Cancer Day. So we felt it was the perfect day to talk about the importance of clinical trials, especially here in the UK. And I'm truly delighted to invite Professor Tom Powles and Professor Rob Jones to this webinar, so we can all chat and discuss your questions regarding the importance of clinical trials and how to get on one. So I will hand over to you both, and thank you so much for doing this, Tom and Rob. Thank you.
We thought we'd start off just Tom and I just giving a little bit of a sort of a background, just for really about sort of 5 or 10 minutes, and then really throw it open to everybody else to ask questions and take it forwards from there. So I don't know, Lucy, are people able to ask questions directly, or is it all through the chat, or how's that going to work?
I've got a few through email, Rob. I've also got a few that I've written all down and through the chat. So to all of you attendees, you can contact by the chat, or you can give us a wave and we'll take your question. It's very interactive the whole way out. So if that's all right, we can start. I can start asking questions. I don't know if you wanted to talk first.
We'll start off. So Tom, I thought it might be useful for you to, do you want to actually help start by maybe explaining what a clinical trial is?
Yeah. So I guess a clinical trial there are two words there. There's a clinical component to it, which suggests that it involves patients in some form or other. And I think that's reasonable. And a trial is obviously an experiment with an unknown answer. So it's asking a question which we don't know the answer to yet. That's different from an audit. An audit is a process in which we look at how we comply with a process. So sunitinib is an established drug in kidney cancer. At my practice, how good am I at giving it? What's the outcome of my patients? That's an audit. A trial is saying, it's like making a new part of the map, trying to identify a new part of the treatment. And the classic clinical trials that patients are most familiar with are clinical trials that involve new drugs. There are a lot of other trials as well, looking at different biomarkers, sometimes quality of life trials, sometimes looking for proteins and X-rays and all sorts of different questions, sometimes devices looking at different, but essentially what we're going to focus on today, I think, is clinical trials. So essentially experiments to find new drugs or prove new drugs work. And there are 3 classic phases of trials. The first phase is the first one, which is a new drug that we don't know very much about that's being tested in man for the first time. And actually, there are not that many of those trials. And then there are phase 2 trials, which are slightly bigger studies when we know the drugs work, but we see how active they are in a group of 50 or 60 patients. And then there are the phase 3 trials. And those are the famous trials that change practice. And they're the randomized trials of 1,000 patients that have a control arm. And that control arm is the old treatment. So it's new treatment versus the old treatment. And we're going to focus pretty much exclusively today on phase 3 trials with a little bit on phase 2. Phase 1, we're not going to do that much of because it's not specific for kidney cancer. And there are some phase 1, I think you have a big phase 1 unit in Glasgow, but they tend to be more first-in-man treatments that don't tend to have a track record in kidney cancer.
So talking about those phase 3 trials, Tom, so you mentioned randomisation.
Yes.
And the other, so can you explain a bit why, well, firstly, what does that mean and why do we randomly treat patients? That doesn't sound like a very sensible thing to do on the first thought, does it?
No, it doesn't. So the issue is that one of the difficulties of doing trials is if you give all of the patients a new treatment. Let's say we've got kidney cancer patients and we've got a new exciting drug, and we give all of our patients that treatment, call it 100 patients, and let's say the response rate is 60 or 70%. That gives us some idea that the drug has activity, but it doesn't give us an idea of a comparative activity compared to the old drugs from before. Because, as you know, some of the Axi-Pembrol's got a response rate of 60%. So the question is the new treatment better than the old treatment? It's all good and well having lots and lots of treatments that work, and we can find probably hundreds of different combinations that work in kidney cancer. What we need to know is it better than the old treatment? And the way you do that is you compare the new treatment with the old treatment. Now, some people say, you know, well, what's the best way of comparing two things with each other? And we can do it by selection. So when a patient comes to see me, I'll say, oh, I'll give this one the new treatment. And the next patient comes in and I say, oh, I'll give that patient the new treatment. And the third patient comes in and I say, I'll give that one the old one. The problem with that is I am selecting patients, and inevitably that will lead to bias. An alternative way of doing it is when the patient comes in, instead of me deciding who gets which treatment, the new treatment or the old treatment, let a computer decide randomly which patient, or a toss of the coin, which patients get the old treatment and the new treatment. And that random process means it eliminates the selective bias, which all humans are likely to do.
And sometimes we have trials that involve placebos. What are placebos, and why do we use them?
So placebos are used for. It's a really good question, and the placebo question is a long one. Placebo is essentially a saltwater tablet or a saltwater infusion. It has no activity. The process I've just talked about a second ago, where some patients get a new treatment and some patients get an old treatment, one of the problems with that is the doctors and the patients know which patients are getting which. And it's possible and conceivable that that bias that we talked about you know, us all wanting the new treatments to work, it's possible by knowing which patients are on the new treatment, doctors might try a little bit harder, patients might fill out the forms pretending to have less side effects because they want the new treatment to work. And so knowing which treatment
you might actually feel better simply because you know
because you're on the new treatment. Yeah. And so there is a small amount, or you might want to keep going longer with treatment because it's new. So there is a small amount of bias associated with that. So let's say that, and you and I have done many of these trials together. Let's say the standard of care is observation, as is currently the case after surgery for kidney cancer. At the moment, no treatment is the standard of care. Let's say that we had a drug, an immune drug that we were giving once a month. We randomize patients, as you've suggested. Half the patients get the immune infusion once every 3 weeks. If the other half just go on observation alone, they're seen once every 12 weeks. And there's obviously a big difference between those two, because those patients coming in every 3 weeks, they might be reporting more symptoms and more problems. So there will be a bias associated with that. So if you give a placebo to the patients who are otherwise going to be on observation, then the doctors and the nurses and the patients don't know which patient is on which treatment. All of the treatments will then be treated identically. All the patients will be treated identically. And that will reduce that treatment bias, which potentially could occur. The problem with that approach is you're clearly asking patients to have an infusion that they don't, half the patients, to have an infusion they don't really need. Having said that, the process of patients, particularly on placebo with no other treatment, the surveillance arm is associated with a degree of bias. And so doing a placebo is probably more perfect, although not always more practical.
So what you're saying there is that if you take part in a trial, even if you're getting just a saltwater infusion, you might actually do better than if you weren't on the trial at all. Is that what you're saying?
Well, no, I think that there is, I'll come to that in a second. So we know that patients on trials do a bit better than patients who aren't on trials. And the reason why that's the case is those patients have a research team that looks after them. So you've got extra people looking after you, number one. Number two is the trial follows the global standard of care. And that tends to be sometimes more intense than you might get from some treating physicians. And so the outcome of trial patients tends to be more robust. We tend to follow the pathway a bit more clearly, and patients have more support. But there's but a placebo by itself obviously will have no increased efficacy associated with it. So no, there's no efficacy associated with that.
So there's a few reasons why a patient might want to go into a trial, aren't there then? So I guess firstly, they might end up getting a treatment which ends up actually being the best treatment for them. Obviously, we don't know that at the start because that's why it's a trial. But I guess there is also that reason that you might go into a trial actually because you get that closer attention to detail and you know, you get that sort of additional attention from the team, and that in itself might be a good thing. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, there are two big groups of trials. There are those phase 2 trials where everyone gets the same treatment, and they tend to include about 100 patients, and they tend to be drugs still in development. And those drug trials where there's no randomization, you know, they're open. The kidney cancer trials, they're open in a lot of hospitals, and those trials tend to be more experimental. We know slightly less about the drug, and there's a bit more luck associated with that. In the randomized trials, the big studies you talked about, it's really important to say, although we talked about placebo, most trials don't have placebo, most are open label, and you will always get the best otherwise standard treatment. You'll never get a treatment that is less good than the current standard of care. So in kidney cancer, as it currently stands, if you wanted to do a frontline trial in kidney cancer, you'd have to compare it to ipi/nivo. Because if you did placebo, no one's going to want to take part.
Yeah, and I guess the other reason to take part in a trial is actually because this is how we make progress. And I think a lot of patients go into trials because, if nothing else, it may help us treat patients who come in the future. And I think, you know, we've seen in recent years, particularly in the drug treatments you talk about, we've seen all these developments. You know, the treatment of kidney cancer has changed many times in the last 10 years, and that's always on the back of these randomized trials, isn't it? What would be the downside? Why don't all patients go into these trials then, Tom?
Well, there are not that many trials. That's the first thing. So not everyone has clinical trials. The second thing is that there's no proof that the drug's going to be better than the treatment you'd have before. Number 3 is the drugs might have adverse event profiles, toxicity that's unexpected. And number 4 is it takes up more time potentially, and you may delay the start of your treatment while you're having the investigations associated with the trial. So there are 4 really good reasons why trials are a bit more difficult. So there's an upside and the downside for everyone. You're absolutely right. Some patients say they just want to take part because they want to help. And other patients said, some patients come to find me to say, what's the best new treatment available in kidney cancer? And is it in a part of a trial? And actually, over the past 5 years in kidney cancer, the trial drugs, because the trials have all been positive, you've always been better being on a trial than getting the standard of care.
But of course, there is always that risk. You may end up getting a new treatment which has all the additional side effects, but turns out to have no additional benefits. And we have, as you say, in recent years, that's not been the case in kidney cancer. But you and I have both taken part in trials where there's been no benefits. It's not a guaranteed win, isn't it?
That's absolutely right. There's risk associated with everything that we do, although it shouldn't and doesn't in the UK preclude you from having standard of care treatment subsequently. So let's say there was a new treatment that was in second line kidney cancer now, and let's call it, you know, beta-2 alpha, whatever it might be. If you had beta-2 alpha post immunotherapy and it didn't work for you, you could then continue on cabozantinib and other drugs subsequently. So it shouldn't preclude you from having those other therapies. Having said that, it's possible your cancer might grow during that period of time, which means it's difficult to get those subsequent therapies. So it's a complicated risk balance ratio. It needs to be discussed with your doctor. But at the moment in kidney cancer, clinical trials have really been a good way of getting the latest drugs.
So just before we open to questions, so Tom, tell me about tell me about a trial you're running at the moment that's exciting you.
Well, there are a number of trials in the UK open at the moment, which are interesting, and they're open in multiple sites around the UK, and they're randomized phase 3 trials, those randomized trials with 2 drugs. One is a trial looking at a new drug called a HIF-1 alpha inhibitor. It's a drug called belzutifan. Belzutifan is a new class of drug in kidney cancer. A guy called Bill Kalin won a Nobel Prize for developing the mechanism of action, which is HIF-2 alpha. It looks to be active in phase 2 trials, and it's now in a randomized phase 3 studies for patients whose cancers have grown on previous therapy, and it's randomized against an mTOR inhibitor called everolimus, and it's a global randomized phase 3 trial. There's a second study for patients who have progressed on immune therapy, and that is cabozantinib which is one of the classic VEGF TKIs, versus cabozantinib plus atezolizumab, which is an immune therapy. So that's VEGF targeted therapy versus VEGF plus immune therapy. Those are
sort of cabozantinib would be actually one of several standard treatments you might have in that situation.
Yeah, in the same way as at the end of treatment, latter line, everolimus would be a standard of care.
In that trial, everybody gets the standard treatment. It's just that half of them get this new drug as well. Yeah,
that's right. And then the last trial, which I wanted to talk about, was the Rampart trial, which is an adjuvant randomized phase 3 study. That's a study where patients with high-risk disease who have had a successful operation with no evidence of disease after the operation. The normal standard of care is to go on to surveillance, which is CT scanning every 3 months. In this study, patients are randomized to CT every 3 months. There's no placebo in this trial, or they get single agent immune therapy or combination immune therapy. And that's a UK-led trial, which is also a randomized phase 3.
And that's designed to see if we can prevent or delay recurrence after surgery. Is that right?
That's right, Rob, because we need to improve this area. At the moment, we've got lots of patients who look like they haven't got metastatic disease. We do an operation and the cancer comes back 1 or 2 years later. And I think that's an area where we can really improve outcomes. So that's a really important area for us in the future. Now, there are other phase 2 trials that we're doing. And indeed, there's some papillary kidney cancer trials looking at ipilimumab and nivolumab immune therapy in papillary kidney cancer.
That's a rarer subtype of cancer, isn't it? It's not the common.
Yeah, that's a rarer subtype. So we do studies in rarer subtypes, not just clear cell kidney cancer.
Lucy, have we got any questions coming?
Yes, I've got loads. And please, everybody, by all means, put your hands up or put it in the chat as well. So I'm just going to start randomly from the top. So say, for example, Tom and Rob, that I wanted to go on the Rampart trial. I'm using that one just because we, as a charity, we fund it, so I know it really well. How would I get on it as a patient? And what how eligible do I need to be for it?
Okay, so I'll maybe take that because I'm actually in the middle of my clinic, and I've literally just seen a man who's about to go onto the Rampart.
Perfect, Rob. Thank you. Thank you.
This is a trial for people who have essentially just had their nephrectomy for the primary treatment of their kidney cancer, and it's for patients where the cancer has not spread. Okay, this is patients who the normal treatment is we wait and we watch, and if and when it comes back, then we start talking about treatment with drugs. So it's really only for patients who have just within a few weeks, essentially, of having had their nephrectomy to go into the trial. Now, as Tom said, this is a trial that's being run throughout the whole of the UK, and most big centres, not every centre, but most big centres are running this trial, and even most small centres should know which of their local big centres are doing it. So in Glasgow, where I work, we cover a geography of about 3 million people, and we have 5 other hospitals where they do kidney cancer surgery that feed into us. And all of the kidney cancer surgeons, that's about 15 kidney cancer surgeons doing nephrectomies, and we know each other well, and they know about the trial. So if you're interested and you think you might sit in that position, say you've just had or even just about to have your nephrectomy, then it's something to ask your surgeon, the urologist, will I be able to take part, and if so, can you put me in touch with the local team that are running this trial? If they don't know the answer to that question, get back to yourself. I venture to suggest, Lucy, you might be able to help put them in touch with a local centre.
Yeah, no idea. And I think that's a lot of time. It's allowing patients how to get access to all these wonderful trials that have got going on.
Your surgeon probably knows the answer, probably knows where to go to ask that question.
Brilliant.
Yeah,
Thank you.
In addition to that point, which is difficult, is that at the beginning of a patient journey, I suspect many patients don't reach out to organisations like Kidney Cancer UK. They're just seen at their hospital, and they do the best they can under those circumstances. And so there's a bit of luck associated with that. And I'm not sure, and one of my ambitions and one of the reasons why I'm involved in this process is I'm quite keen to find a way of broadcasting the trials that are open in the UK more eloquently to the patient community. At the moment, I think it relies on quite a lot of luck. So if you happen to be treated at Bristol that has a big kidney cancer group with a big kidney cancer, trial group, you're going to take part. But if you happen to be at Bath and the people at Bath and Bristol don't communicate with each other very well and hospitals don't talk to each other very well, it's possible there are people 30 miles up the road who are not getting any of those opportunities, but would just as probably live halfway between the two institutions.
Thomas, there's a couple of questions on this very topic, really, with people's sort of personal stories in here as well, just come through on the chat. So
yeah, go for it, Rob.
the first one's from Heidi Parkman there, saying, I don't live near a specialist kidney cancer centre. How can I ensure I get the option to go on a trial if I want to? So if that is, I don't know, it's not name centres, but if that's a centre where you're concerned that you're not being given these opportunities, how would you go about that, Tom?
So, listen, I think that the patients are incredibly powerful in some ways, in that you can. What I mean by that is, the health service is designed for patients, not for doctors or for managers. And so, if you say to your doctor, "No, I want to take part, or I want to know about kidney cancer trials here and within a 100-mile radius," your doctors will find out for you. And in fact, half my practice comes from people who come from within probably a 50-mile radius who didn't first pitch up to their hospital. And I've got a network of people who refer me patients in the same way as you do. And that network is very important. And most doctors are very comfortable doing that. One of the beauties of the UK system is doctors aren't paid for seeing patients particularly. There's an upside and a downside to that. One of the upsides to it means that the doctor's got no incentive to say, yes, no, it must be me looking after you, because otherwise I can't pay my mortgage. So we're very happy, as a rule, to pass patients amongst each other to give them the best opportunities available to them.
You probably need to ask a specialist, is the point. And there's another question here from Richard about having obviously had quite a lot of treatment in the past. And you're right, the answer to your question is that there will be some trials. So the question is, I've had all of these treatments: sunitinib, pazopanib, nivolumab, cabozantinib, surgery, radiotherapy. Where do I go next? I think is the question, really. And would I be suitable for trials? Well, the answer to that question is you won't be suitable for all trials, because some of them are very specifically for patients who've maybe had no treatment before. But there probably are trials out there that may be suitable in your situation. I think it's very difficult to list exactly which trials may be suitable.
That HIF trial versus everolimus is for that sort of population. I think it might be for people who've only had 3 previous therapies rather than the 4, but I'm not sure. But there will be trials in kidney cancer for that.
But it depends a little bit, I think, on the circumstances of those treatments. But
that
might be an option for Richard. And that's a trial that's being run in 7 or 8 centres around the UK, I think, Tom, is that right? Yeah, certainly we're doing it here. You're doing it down in Bart's. There's another question. I think this is a really, and it touches back on your thing about doctors passing patients around. I'm happy to go on trials, but I don't want to change my consultant as we get along well. I'm concerned that some trials, e.g. the cancer vaccine, are only available in London or Manchester, and I'm in Leeds. And so actually, I think this almost reflects almost against that, is that some patients build a very strong relationship with an individual consultant, and that often is a very positive thing therapeutically as well.
But Rob, that's not a reason not for going to see someone else.
Yeah,
I mean, it's not like because I think it's reasonable to have that relationship, but to go and see someone else to say, are there opportunities for me? And often, if that trial doesn't work, one can always go back to, and that's common with our practice, one can always go back to see the original doctor. But I mean, I think that there does come a point in metastatic kidney cancer where, as it currently stands, with so many new drugs being developed, I think, and most doctors that I meet, and I'm putting myself included, are not particularly possessive about, of course, I like Grant and I see him every Wednesday morning and be disappointed at whatever it might, of course, but at the same time, I want what's best for them as well. And if that involves a new drug that I can't give them, I'd be pleased for that. And that doesn't mean I'll never see Grant again.
Yeah, and certainly, if I'm particularly if I'm seeing a patient who's maybe traveling quite a long way for the trial, I'll definitely want there to be still some continuity back home, because What if something goes wrong in the middle of the night? You're not going to want to travel the width of the country to see me. It's really important you still have a home team looking after you there. So obviously, you know, the intensity of that relationship may change a bit if most of the visits are within the trial, but I think most consultants will be keen, will actually want to keep in touch.
Joint care. Yeah, that's absolutely right.
Thank you. There's another question. I don't know if you guys can see it or not. I have not had an nephrectomy, only had immunotherapy, which is IPI and Nivo, which had to stop last year due to side effects. Still seems to have the cancer is stable, but it started to progress again. What treatments would be recommended, please?
So that trial that Rob talked about before, Contact 3, which is cabozantinib versus cabozantinib plus atezolizumab, is a study that's open. Cabozantinib would be the standard of care at this point, or another VEGF TKI, sunitinib, axitinib. They're all about the same as far as I'm concerned. So yeah, there are lots of options available for this individual.
Yeah. So there's not standard options there, but it's quite an important point actually that trials are not just for people who've run out of standard options. So there may be that one of your options is a trial. So, you know, as I say, actually in that situation, there's actually a whole list of standard drugs you might consider using. But it may be that a trial such as that trial you mentioned would be an alternative to that.
Thank you. So another question has actually come up this week, and it was actually for another oncologist as well, that they live in the Swansea area and there's no clinical trials available. What do you do if you live in like rural Wales? Where can you go and what's about? I don't know if that's...
Well, Swansea's actually been quite an active centre for kidney cancer trials in recent years, hasn't it, Tom?
Yes, it has, Robert.
Professor Wagstaff's working there. He's a very well-known in kidney cancer trials. So don't assume just because you're in a small place that there won't be trials. Conversely, don't assume just because you're in a big city that the trials will necessarily be running there. It's not always quite as logical as that. So if you're in a small place and the trial isn't open, though, I think, you know, again, I think your specialist should at least, they may not know which trials are open, but they should know who to talk to. Because, you know, it's quite a small world, that particularly oncologists who treat kidney cancer. There's not that many of us around the UK. We pretty much all know each other well enough that we could fire off an email or pick up the phone to somebody in the local centre who would know about the trials that are open. I get these inquiries all the time from people, you know, what trials are open, etc. I've got this patient, that patient, or the other. So ask your specialist first. If you're really not having any luck there, then I don't know whether that's something you can help with, Lucy, putting people in touch with bigger centres.
Completely, yeah. And I do have a habit of doing that. I think I ring Tom quite a lot, especially in England, don't I? And text.
You're very welcome.
Thank you. And honestly, Tom, I'm incredibly grateful. Another question I had, this is quite a hard question, I think, quite a general question. When it comes to clinical trials, how do you decide to go on one, and what are the benefits for you?
For you, the patient, you mean?
Yeah, sorry, as a patient perspective, yeah.
So I always encourage, I always regard my job in this is not to get the patient onto the trial, but to help the patient make the right decision for them, okay? Because sometimes going on the trial is not right for every patient, but no harm's done by having a conversation about it, okay? So I would normally say to a patient, well, look, here are the positive reasons and here are the negative reasons. We've kind of touched on on the positive reasons, and you will always be given a hopefully very clearly written and often over detailed information sheet about the trial, because it's part of the sort of the regulatory legal setup for a trial. There has to be a good written information sheet. But you do have to think about the negative things as well. I always tell patients with drug trials, at least, usually the most important negative thing to think about is the potential for additional side effects and whether that's something you're prepared to put up with. And again, you know, all the information should be there about the drug. You know, given that sometimes if it's a very new drug, we may not have all the information, so there may be uncertainties about side effects. I think the other thing you've also got to consider is, you know, that there is additional commitment in taking part in a trial. Most trials have additional hospital visits, additional tests, often more frequent scans. And if you're traveling long distances, often all that work has to be done in the centre where the trial is being run. So for some patients, actually, that burden of extra hospital visits is more than they're prepared to put up with. A lot of patients, for reasons we've outlined, conversely like that extra attention to detail, but it's a personal thing. So I think those are the two sort of main areas that I usually encourage patients to think about as to why it may not be right for them. And you've also got to consider, well, what are my alternatives to going into this trial?
Brilliant, thank you, Rob. Another question I got earlier today to ask was, I want to give something back. This is a patient perspective, because the NHS has been so wonderful to me. So I want to take part in a clinical trial, not just for me, but to help the future. And how do I know how the clinical trial works out? Where do I find the results of how the clinical trial's like? Well, obviously, it's got to close first for you guys to get the results of the trial. How do you find out the results of a clinical trial and the benefits it's had for like the future of in the kidney cancer world?
So if you have taken part in a trial, we try and make every effort to let participants know the results of the trial. Now, part of the problem with that is some of these trials take many years to deliver, okay? And so sometimes, you know, it's not possible to update patients with the results of the trials. That information sheet I list usually will give you some information about how you can find out about the results of trials. Nearly always is, well, in fact, there's a legal obligation now that these results of trials have to be published within at least a year of the finalisation of the trial. So it's always out there in some way, but it can be sometimes a bit difficult to trace those. And I say part of the problem is it can sometimes be many years after the individual patient has even finished taking part in the trial before the actual results are available. I mean, conversely, some trials give results much quicker.
Perfect, thank you, Rob. Another question. I hope this is all right. You can fire those questions off at you both. Are there any treatments being trialled aimed at avoiding surgery in early stage kidney cancer?
So the answer to that question is we're not doing terribly well with that in kidney cancer right now. So we should be doing more neoadjuvant trials. We're not doing that many. I don't have one open right now.
Neoadjuvant, what does that mean, Tom?
Sorry. Before surgery, you give a drug, you shrink the cancer down, it disappears, and you don't need surgery.
Yeah.
That's the goal of what I'm trying to do, but we haven't done that. Most of the time, we give a period of treatment before surgery, and we still perform the surgery. You might say, what's the point in doing both? And the answer to that is, well, we think it might reduce the risk of the cancer coming back in the future, and it may also reduce the complexity potentially of the surgery. So those perioperative trials are not as mature as I'd like in kidney cancer. Rob and I also do urothelial cancer, and more progress I think is being made in other cancers and indeed in lung cancer. And it might be because the kidney cancer operation is relatively straightforward.
Yeah. I mean, it's closed now, but there was a recent trial we did in the UK. It was called the Naxiba trial, where we took patients where they were going for a nephrectomy, but because the cancer was quite advanced, sometimes the cancers grow up into the vein, a vein called the vena cava. And if the cancer is growing into the vena cava, the operation is not as simple. So I just turned my phone off there.
I'll keep going.
And what it showed was that actually you could use drugs to reduce the severity of the operation. But just to sort of answer the question directly, you know, the other area is there are almost certainly some patients out there with kidney cancer which is very small and very slow growing and probably never need an operation. It's quite difficult. We have done trials in that area in the past. I'm trying to think of any active trials. There are one or two very small trials going on looking at alternatives to operations there. So I know that there's some trials going on looking at maybe using radiotherapy instead of surgery. But there's also a lot of interest in trying to identify, well, which patients can we actually leave alone altogether? That's at the moment, that's not really a trial at the minute, but there's a study called the EASE study, which is a bit more like an audit study that Tom referred to earlier, where it's across Europe, where we're trying to collect information on these patients with small, slow-growing tumours, and also collecting tissue from the biopsies to see if we can actually predict which patients can we actually afford to leave alone because they're not at risk. So it's not really trials at the moment, but it's quite an active area of interest.
Lucy, I need to go in about 10 minutes. I wanted to ask a couple of questions to the group, actually. So the first thing I wanted to say was that I think the investigators, the kidney cancer investigators in the UK, want to engage more with patients and want to broadcast the work that we're doing. What Rob has said is correct, that we don't want patients to take part in trials. We want patients to be aware there are opportunities available for them. And at the moment, I think it is very dependent on which cancer centre you go to or which hospital you go to about whether you get offered these. And one of the things that we wanted to do was work out from a patient perspective, what's the best way of broadcasting these to the United Kingdom.
So have you got any feedback on that at all? How they
I thought what we might do is we might have a second meeting, and in that second meeting we might give people time to think about what we've said today. What I was planning to do was to get a list of trials that are currently available in the centres where they're currently open, and then give them to Kidney Cancer UK and update that every 3 months. And so that we have this meeting every 3 months, and every 3 months we talk about the trials, and then Kidney Cancer UK has an updated list, because one of the things we've noticed is we sometimes do this, but if we don't update it every 3 months, it gets out of date very quickly because trials open and close in a heartbeat. So that's something that I wanted to do, but I wanted to get the patient feedback if that's the right thing to do.
Yeah, I think definitely. There's a couple of comments in the chat, and also we could almost have like a live web page where we keep updating it, Tom, couldn't we, and Rob? So it gets constantly current with the latest trials that are available. That would probably work very well as well.
Right, but as Tom suggested, it can sometimes be quite difficult just keeping track of things.
Yes.
It would have to be a bit of caveats around that, obviously.
No, it's a great idea, Tom. Thank you.
Do we have some more questions?
I think majority of them actually you guys have answered. Yes, yeah, I think you have. Yeah, I think a lot of them about the future clinical trials. I think also patients are so passionate and they want to help get awareness out to help you guys get more drugs available for a fire trial. So I think we all need to pull together, don't we, and get more awareness of clinical trials, and then more people, if it's suitable for them, to go on them.
I think on a positive note, if you look back, when do we introduce sunitinib in the UK? I think NICE accepted it in 2009.
Yeah.
That's only 12 years ago. And before that, we really had very little in the way of drug treatment for kidney cancer. And we've now got about 12 or 13 drugs that we can use. Obviously, we wouldn't use all 12 or 13 of them in any one patient. But, the actual impact these drugs are making, each trial is a small gain. But this all adds up, and actually, because we've been able to deliver these trials, and then most of them are done globally, they're not just UK. Because we've been able to deliver these trials, we've really got quite a good momentum going, particularly, I would say, in kidney cancer. Actually, I think we're probably doing better in kidney cancer in terms of the rate of progress than almost any other. Partly because there was quite a lot of catch-up to be done, to be honest with you. But on the positive note is it really is making a difference doing these trials.
Brilliant, thank you. There's a few more questions. Are you all right if I carry on asking? Yeah. I was once told that I was too low risk for a trial. Is that right? That's from Richard.
It's a bit, yeah. I mean, they may have had a specific trial open at that specific centre, which that particular patient wasn't eligible for. There are low-risk trials, there are high-risk trials, there are surgery trials, there are drug trials. There's every permutation and combination. And it is possible that there was a trial which he was potentially eligible for, but his risk group wasn't quite right. The eligibility to some of the trials can be very specific. That doesn't mean he's still not eligible. He or she is still not eligible for a trial, and everything changes with time.
The truth is, we'd like to have a trial for every patient, but sometimes there just isn't a specific trial for that particular set of characteristics that the patient has, but it changes all the time.
Thank you. Heidi has asked, are there still limited to 3 NHS funded rounds of treatment? I've been told that a lot of patients don't seem to be aware.
I don't know the answer to that question. I probably should. So that will be an NHS rather than a clinical trial issue. But certainly, if you had a clinical trial, that wouldn't limit the number of NHS treatments you were available to. So it's seen as even if it's a sort of a standard of care type treatment, the treatment shouldn't be seen as, if it's a trial related drug, as taking away from what would be an NHS treatment.
Yeah, I'm afraid because I work in Scotland, where the rules of access are slightly different. We certainly don't have a specific 3 treatment limit within the NHS in Scotland. Obviously, there are restrictions on who can have which drugs, but it's not limited to a number of types of treatment. I'm afraid, like Tom, I'm less able to comment on the detail of the NHS England ruling.
Thank you. I've got a message from Parry. If you're happy, I haven't got your question through, if I'm honest. You wanted to ask a question through the emails. Do you mind putting it in the box, please? Because I haven't got my emails open to read it, I'm afraid. Patients and trials should share their experiences of side effects and outcomes on social media, and this could influence the outcomes. Maybe we could do a few blogs on people's side effects and how they've got on clinical trials.
We could certainly talk about side effects of clinical trials.
Yeah.
The challenge with that is that each drug is going to be different, and there are probably about 20 or 30 drugs being tested, and the side effects of one group of drugs is going to be different from another. So while it would help other patients on that particular study, it might not help patients on a different drug trial.
Brilliant.
Yeah. Alison, I know, is very well informed in clinical trials. I guess your question is actually, by sharing this information on social media, are you actually in some way damaging the trial, or at least influencing the outcome of the trial? I guess theoretically, people might be able to work out who was on it and who was on placebos, and that could theoretically introduce bias. In reality, it's highly unlikely that that would change the outcome of the trial for the worse, in my view.
I've just read Parry's text message.
Thanks, Tom.
And I think the answer is there are trials, Parry, for you. Contact 03, which is cabozantinib versus cabozantinib, plus atezolizumab might be an option for you. Also, that HIF trial would be an option for you as well. So there are studies out there that you'd be potentially eligible for, and it would be reasonable to explore that. And you should ask your doctor if that's possible.
And there's a question at the bottom on that about CyberKnife specifically, Tom.
You can, if you have CyberKnife, you can still take place in systemic therapy trials, providing there is what we describe as measurable cancer. So providing all the cancer hasn't disappeared, and you haven't had all of the areas hit by CyberKnife, then that would be, you would still potentially be eligible. Again, that's worth talking to your doctor about.
People's information, CyberKnife is one of several different technologies to allow you to apply radiotherapy to very specific areas of cancer.
Thank you. Thank you, both of you. Has anybody got any more questions for Tom or Rob before they go? I don't think so.
Should we do this again?
Love to, Tom.
Rob, would you be happy to do it again?
Yeah, sure, yeah.
45 minutes every 3 months. We'll get a list for you. We'll make it work.
Go for it. Thank you both so much. I'm so grateful. We all are. And yeah, the patient sounds good. Yeah, that's what they want. And thank you so much for your time and for both your support to Kidney Cancer UK. It's so very much appreciated. I love the fact that I can ring you both and you're always there. So a sincere thank you from me as well.
Thank you very much.
Okay, all the best, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone, and thank you for attending.